Hey guys, so I'm Claire LaBlance and Allie and Miranda are also in my group, and we are talking about life and death decision making by adolescents and Trevor's case. So we're on the side that Trevor's parents should have decisional authority, which is the no side. So first, a little bit about the background of adolescent life and death decision making. Most articles would say that an adolescent is about 12 to 18 years old, and then at 18 years old, you're considered legally an adult. So the big question is whether parents or the adolescent has the final decision-making authority, and we're saying that the parent does. So what makes pediatric decision-making different? There's a few reasons. One, not all children or adolescents are in the same stage at the same time. So they develop at different rates with different family situations and different environments. So it's kind of hard to say a specific stage that they're at a certain time. Also, adolescents are have an evolving capacity, unlike adults where they may no longer have decision-making capacity, but you might be able to look back into the past when they did previously have decision-making capacity and look at decisions that they have made at that point. We can't do this with adolescents because when they were younger, they definitely didn't have decision-making capacity. So a little bit about Trevor's case specifically. Trevor is a 16-year-old boy. At 12 years old, he was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. He received chemo for 8 months and went into remission. 2 years later, he then relapsed and had high doses of chemo and radiation again. Also received a bone marrow transplant where his brother was his donor. When he recovered, he was able to go back to school but was behind his friends in classes. He then had a second relapse, and this is where we kind of stand currently. So he has two options that the physicians gave him. He can either begin chemo with a 15% chance of remission and 2 to 3 years to live, or he can begin palliative care, which would focus on relieving symptoms and allow him to have 6 to 12 months to live. So Trevor is more on the side of palliative care. He has not been able to live a normal life, and he just wants to be able to live his teenage years like a normal boy, with his friends in school as much as he can while he has time to live. And his parents are on the other side. They want him to continue with chemo and hope that in 2 to 3 years, when he's still living from the chemo, that there would be a cure for this or more treatments that are better. So they are just hopeful that by the time in 2 to 3 years that there would be new options. So now we're going to go into the arguments that are in favor of Trevor's parents having decisional authority. So the first argument we have is about emotional reactions. So a lot of studies have found that adolescents do have the capacity to make decisions. They're able to think rationally, use intellectual thoughts. Another study looked at the 9 indicators of competency. So these are choice, comprehension, creativity, compromise, consequentiality, correctness, credibility, consistency, and commitment. So they found that although adolescents are able to decide on a choice with creative problem solving and commit to the choice with understanding on what is correct, they are not able to create multiple options and weigh the risk and benefits of these options. They also have trouble understanding when information is coming from a credible source, and then foreseeing the consequences of that decision. So although adolescents can problem solve to come up with the correct choice, their final decisions are usually based on emotions without thinking about the consequences and the risks of that choice. This is especially when they're faced with an urgent decision. So life and death decisions are usually urgent, don't have a lot of time to make them, and this is when they really start to rely on their feelings instead of looking at the consequences of these decisions.
Hi everyone, my name is Miranda O'Hara and I am the third person in this group. I'm going to be focusing on arguments 2 and 3. So not only are adolescents more vulnerable to rash decision making due to emotional immaturity, kind of what Claire was saying, they also have limited life experience. Adults tend to have a better understanding of the world, as their critical thinking skills aren't biologically clouded by the developing brain. According to the Institute of Medicine and National Research Council of the National Academies Press, many adolescents tend to be strongly oriented toward and sensitive to peers, responsive to their immediate environments, limited in self-control, and disinclined to focus on long-term consequences, all of which lead to compromised decision-making skills in emotionally charged situations. So basically what this is saying is that the developing adolescent brain is caught up in all these distractions, whether it's their peers in their immediate environment, different tense emotional situations, and honestly just like the really hard self-control issues that these adolescents don't have a chance to step back and think critically about whatever situation they're in, therefore learning valuable life experience. I'm sure that everyone can look back at their adolescent years and see many different situations that they've been in that models this exactly. As a result, parents should protect an adolescent from rash decision making by giving them a strong foundation and allowing them to learn pertinent background information to make sure that the adolescent's life plan is not altered negatively. Now, I do still believe it's important for the adolescent to be involved in decision making. However, since parents aren't clouded by the same emotional immaturity as adolescents, I believe it is really important for the parents to have the final decision. As with the last argument, I'm sure that we can all look back and see that this next argument is true for most of us. I know that whenever I was in this stage, there were plenty of times where I relied on my parents for access to care. So our next argument is clearly adolescents' access to care depends heavily upon their parents. Adolescents frequently rely on their parents for financial support, setting up doctor's appointments, understanding medical language, and transport to and from doctor's appointments are likely given by family as well. On the financial side, the Pew Research Center evaluated 2018 U.S. Census data. It showed that only about 24% of young adults are financially stable and financially independent from their parents. 45% of people aged 18 to 25 received a large sum of financial support from their parents in the last year. Now, while this doesn't apply to adolescents, I think this is an interesting trend to note, as it can be inferred that if young adults who are more emotionally mature and have even better reasoning and logical assessment than adolescents, if they can't even financially support themselves, then an adolescent likely cannot. I think it's also important to understand that setting up doctor's appointments for adolescents can be scary. I know that whenever I was young, I had issues with this. In addition to this, understanding medical language is really difficult. There is a ton of medical terms that even normal adults don't understand, and trying to press that onto an adolescent, I'm sure, is even harder.
This is Allie Bodine, and I will be presenting some potential counter-arguments that will be in favor of Trevor being able to decide for himself as to which treatment option he would like to pursue. I will then present responses to each of the counter-arguments, addressing why Trevor's parents should have decisional authority in this adolescent life and death decision-making case. One counter-argument in favor of Trevor, a 16-year-old, having decision-making authority would be that as a 16-year-old, he has the same capacity to make competent medical decisions as an 18-year-old. 18-year-olds currently are able to make their own medical decisions. As determined by researchers Whitehorn and Campbell, 14-year-olds in general demonstrate a level of competency in providing informed consent and refusal for medical and psychological treatment equivalent to that of adults, according to 4 standards of competency: evidence of choice, rational reasons, reasonable outcome, and understanding. Additional findings by Mann, Hermani, and Power suggest that adolescents 15 years and older are demonstrating a reliable level of competence in their ability to understand decision-making, as well as their ability to problem solve, make correct choices, and commit to a course of action. Lawrence Steinberg also determined that minors aged 15 and older are able to exhibit decision-making competence equivalent to adults in situations with minimal emotional arousal and peer influence. One example of adolescents making their own healthcare decisions today is in the Netherlands. Currently there, children from the age of 16 on are able to make their treatment decisions independently, and under this jurisdiction, Trevor, a 16-year-old, would be able to make his own medical decisions. In response to the counterargument, we argue that the current definition of having decision-making capacity at the age of 18 years old is in fact an arbitrary cutoff, and that the cutoff should be higher, possibly around age 25. The counterargument above references how adolescents can make competent decisions in hypothetical situations. However, these hypothetical situations do not have the same emotional aspect that navigating a real-life scenario that applies to you would have. Thus, while adolescents and adults may make equally competent decisions in these hypothetical scenarios, there is no evidence that this competency extends to real life, according to Ross. Real-life situations involve factors like emotional arousal and pressure from peers that are likely to influence those of younger age, especially those without fully developed brains. Adolescents experience high responsivity to emotional and social stimuli because their brain regions for emotional processing develop early in comparison to the brain regions necessary for cognitive control, according to Casey and colleagues. The limbic system, which controls emotional processing, develops during one's teenage years. And the limbic system develops years before the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain region involved in cognitive control. The brain regions that enable regulation and self-control develop later in life, even beyond the years of adolescence. Diminished cognitive performance in 18 to 21-year-olds relative to adults over 21 when placed under brief and prolonged negative emotional arousal has been documented. This reduced performance occurs at the same time as several brain regions exhibit poor functioning. There is decreased frontoparietal circuitry activity, which is a brain region that is involved in cognitive control. Meanwhile, at the same time, 18 to 21-year-olds exhibit increased ventromedial prefrontal cortex activity, which is indicative of higher involvement of brain regions that are associated with emotional processes. As such, the developmental transition into exhibiting cognitive capacity in emotional environments depends upon dynamic prefrontal circuitry changes. And since the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until age 25, the arbitrary cutoff of 18 years old in order to make medical decisions actually should be higher, potentially 25 years old, as the brain functions enabling cognitive control remain necessary for decision-making. Another counter-argument in favor of Trevor making his own medical decisions would be that healthcare rights for adolescents should not depend on context. Adolescents may consent independently of their parents for certain treatments, like abortion, addiction treatment, contraception, emergency treatment, mental health treatment, pregnancy counseling, STD testing, and substance abuse counseling in some states, according to Ross. A patient's right to refuse is stronger than a patient's right to request, according to Lowe, a bioethicist. Negative rights are stronger than positive rights. Thus, if we allow some positive rights for adolescents, such as those described above, why would we not allow the negative right for Trevor to refuse medical care? Another point would be that if we deem adolescents competent to access those treatments independently via their own consent, should we not permit adolescents to make other decisions? If we trust a 16-year-old like Trevor to drive on his own, should we not permit him to refuse a life-saving treatment? In response to this counterargument, we claim that specialized consent laws remain necessary and do not justify granting adolescents decisional authority. Adolescents may access those specific treatments without parental consent, due to how, without access, public health problems could occur. Given the stigma surrounding treatment for these conditions, many adolescents would not feel comfortable relying on their parents to access treatment, warranting these specialized consent laws. On the other hand, it is unlikely that the treatment decision made in Trevor's case will result in a public health crisis of any sort. In fact, his choice to refuse treatment potentially increases the amount of healthcare resources available to the general public. Emancipating children in medical decision-making makes them more vulnerable. If society deems adolescents like Trevor fit to make their own medical decisions, a slippery slope argument surfaces. That permittance could result in the dissolution of child labor laws, binding contracts, and other unintended outcomes that increase the adolescent's vulnerability, according to Ross. In conclusion, adolescent life and death decision-making presents potential conflicts over who should be the decision-making authority, either 16-year-old Trevor or his parents. In the case of Trevor, a 16-year-old with acute myeloid leukemia, the person or persons with decisional authority must determine what treatment option to pursue. We argue on behalf of following Trevor's parents' preference to pursue further treatment of high-dose chemotherapy for Trevor. Trevor's parents should have decisional authority because Trevor likely remains particularly vulnerable to emotional reactions, has limited life experiences, and depends on his parents for access to medical care. Furthermore, adolescents at age 16, like Trevor, do not have fully developed brain regions which control cognitive control operations like regulation and self-control. Permitting Trevor to refuse his life-saving medical treatment on his own accord leaves Trevor vulnerable, as this change to current protocols could lead to further emancipation of adolescents in other unintended areas of life. Due to the preceding arguments stated, Claire, Miranda, and I argue on behalf of granting Trevor's parents decisional authority in this adolescent life and death decisional conflict. These are our references. Thank you for viewing our presentation.